some glass beads. But upon further examination of African history, you will find out that the Africans were not stupid. You're not just going to go over there and buy scores of people for something so trivial as a barrel of rum and some glass beads. I mean, this is the same region that was once home to the great Mansa Musa and the great universities in Timbuktu. These people knew what they were doing. They knew commerce. They've been trading with the Arabs for centuries. They understood the concept of supply and demand. If you have a supply and there's a demand, you can jack up the price accordingly. So if one was to apply some common sense to the situation, like, hey, these Africans weren't as dumb as, history would like to portray them, then you would have to conclude that these Africans, if they did sell other Africans into slavery, that they would control the market or corner the market and jack up the price to make it, to maximize their profit, which in turn would hit European slave traders squarely in the pockets. Now, let's say European slave traders wanted to usurp that and say, well, you know what? We don't want to pay you for these slave captives. We're just going to put our own boots on the ground and go capture our own slaves. That alone still costs money. You got to pay the men. You got to buy their ammunition. You got to buy their weapons, chains, rope, provisions for the long treks throughout, West Africa. All that still costs money. At the end of the day, if you was to, do the math out, I would, estimate that it would be probably the same. They were probably selling, each slave for the price of a modern day Lamborghini. Given all the conditions in place and whatnot, it would probably cost the price of a Lamborghini to bring one African slave over from Africa across the Atlantic. And seeing that at that time the crown had money problems because they were stretched thin with, trying to get people to colonize the Americas, problems on the home front, conflicts with the French, etc. They were stretched thin. They didn't have money like that. But what they did have is an overpopulated continent whom they could use the lower rung of that said population to work the colonies. I imagine that it went something like this. You had a gentleman in South London, family, and, he was a father of a family of five and whatnot, out of work, no job. So he stole and begged and bartered for to feed his family. He runs through the local market, snatches a mutton joint and a loaf of bread. The guards gaffle him, take him before the magistrate or the judge or whatever. And he's thinking, I'll just get a dozen lashes in a night in the stockholds or whatever. But the judge says, you know what? We're gonna sentence you to death. And he's like, well, hold on now. All I did was steal a mutton joint and a loaf of bread. And you're gonna send me to the gallows? And the judge says, well, you know, there's an alternative to this. Now, see, you can either go to the gallows in the morning, or in the morning you can get on the next ship to the New World, and you will be sentenced as an indentured servant for the next 5 years, you and your family. What you think he chose? He chose that indentured servitude. And furthermore, when you actually do the math on the transatlantic slave trade, the shit don't add up. We talking about 17 million African captives who were forcibly removed from one continent and transplanted to another continent in roughly a 270-year span. Now, the trip took 4 to 6 months. That's not even including hurricane season. Now, let's say hurricane season is from August to the end of September going into October. So nothing is moving in or out them ports in hurricane season. And you mean to tell me you're gonna bring over a shipload of 500 butt naked slaves in January in to Virginia in the month of January when it's freezing cold? Come on, man. It doesn't add up. 17 million in 270 years is roughly 150 to 200 a day. That's just a day. So let's say it came in every other day. It would have to be 400 to 500 every other day over a course of 270 years to meet that 17 million number. That's impossible. Impossible. Who, where did they get the lumber to build all these ships? And where did they get the workers to build all these ships? If you got enough workers to build hundreds of thousands of ships, and you got even more hundreds of thousands of men to man these vessels, why not just use that manpower to work the colonies? You're spending more money than you need to. It's just excessive spending. And then when you examine the condition in which said African captives were under during the Middle Passage, one would only conclude that, let's say, 200 captives were on a boat. Given those conditions, I would estimate that only 10 of them survived, if that. Now, if you pay money to buy or even capture them, and you're coming back with 80% of your load lost, you're not in the black, you're in the red. You're losing money. The numbers don't add up. The money don't add up. And the science and biology of the whole narrative doesn't add up. Looking at it from an economical standpoint, it would have been more beneficial for the crown to take their lower rung of population, force them into an indentured servitude on slash slavery, and force them to work the colonies. That's how you kill two birds with one stone. You depopulate your homeland and you get workers to work the colonies over yonder. Now, as I progressed through my scholastic endeavors, I came upon certain classes like political science. And once again, I applied the same strategy to my political science class as I did to my history class. Read every chapter. Everything that was in a book, I read it. And even more pieces started to fall into place, such as when I read about the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Look that up. The Dawes Act of 1887, and other acts and legislation that were put into place that incentivized the Aboriginal population here in North America to assimilate to the status quo. Now think about all this legislation and all of this math and science that I just dropped on you amongst the backdrop of the fact that there is archaeological evidence that states that the earliest inhabitants in this hemisphere were a Negroid people. Like, this is shit that's been on the Discovery Channel, History Channel, National Geographic, you know, Lucia, the Olmec heads, all of that. But the narrative concerning all that is, well, yeah, it was niggas here before anybody else got here, but some strange reason, somehow, some way, they all died out or got killed off. Really, really. Smallpox, blankets covered in smallpox, that is what brought about the Aboriginal American genocide because they had no immunity towards it whatsoever. Come on now. This planet been around for millions of years. Every disease imaginable has been on every continent that you can think of. Come on now. But to get back to the legislation that was put in place, there was certain legislation that entailed where the rising United States government made treaties with the Aboriginal population, and they said, yeah, you know what? Okay, we'll let you guys join us, yada yada yada, but under a few conditions. You have to take on our names, learn our language, and learn our customs, and basically assimilate. So they set up in place, and this is documented legislation. You can look this up for yourself. Where they set up schools and whatnot, where they took young Aboriginal children from the United States, right? Put them up in these schools and said, okay, wrote a whole bunch of names on a blackboard and said, go up to this blackboard and pick a name off the board. Whatever name you pick, that's your name. Whatever last name you pick, that's your family's last name. There wasn't no, what's your name, boy? Toby. Wasn't none of that going on. This was systematic. I say all that to say that you're dealing with a lot of people in the Northeast, but where I'm from, Middle America, I deal with a lot of people from the middle and from the South. And when you get into the South, you're gonna come across a lot of black people who know that they are the original inhabitants of this landmass. And there are Negroid inhabitants of this landmass in the Northeast, the North, out west, everywhere. This whole hemisphere was a black hemisphere at one point in time. But I say that to say the identity, when a people does not identify with the landmass in which they inhabit, they don't feel a sense of pride. And I can tell you from experience, when you change your perspective and you're looking at the land in which you inhabit from the perspective of, this is my land, my ancestors been here, it kind of galvanizes your spirit and gives you a newfound motivation. I mean, for instance, say before, let's say, an African American thought that he was from Africa, he rides through his neighborhood and sees trash on the side of the street. He's like, I don't care, man. I'm trying to get back to Kemet anyway. As opposed to when he actually comes to the know of this and says, man, this has been my land for the past millennia or so, right? He feels offended by seeing that trash on the street. He might pull over and pick that trash up. And like I said in part one, this is not an attack on you, but you know, I ride with you on a lot of stuff that you say, but when you get into this this African type of stuff and African Americans and just detaching us from this land, it just kind of rubs me the wrong way, and it just doesn't sit well with me. So you know, those are my viewpoints. I'll probably have a little bit more for you, but this is Benjamin D'Souza.